In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and streets buzzed with life, a man named Steve Harvey sat in his dressing room. The room was small but cozy, filled with the faint scent of cologne and freshly brewed coffee. Steve adjusted his tie in the mirror, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles. He had been hosting late-night talk shows for years, and he prided himself on making people laugh. But tonight felt different. There was an odd energy in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The guest list for the evening included a mix of personalities: a comedian, a chef, and a young woman named Karoline Leavitt. Steve didn't know much about her except that she was a political analyst who had recently gained attention for speaking openly about social issues. Her name wasn't as familiar as some of the celebrities he usually interviewed, but there was something intriguing about her. Maybe it was the way her publicist described her, calm yet determined, or maybe it was just curiosity tugging at him. Whatever it was, Steve decided to keep an open mind. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the production assistants, reminding him that the show would start in 10 minutes. Steve nodded, grabbed his notes, and headed toward the stage. As he walked through the bustling corridors of the studio, he could hear the distant murmur of the audience settling into their seats. The sound always gave him a little thrill, like standing on the edge of a diving board ready to leap. When Steve stepped onto the brightly lit stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He waved and grinned, his signature charm lighting up the room. "Good evening, everybody," he called out, his voice booming over the cheers. "Are you ready for a great show?" The audience responded with even louder applause, and Steve chuckled. "All right, let's get started." The first two guests went smoothly. The comedian cracked jokes that left everyone in stitches, and the chef demonstrated how to make a quick dessert that looked almost too good to eat. By the time the second segment ended, Steve was feeling confident. But then came the moment he had been waiting for, and dreading a little too. Karoline Leavitt was next. As she walked onto the stage, Steve studied her closely. She was younger than he expected, probably in her late 20s or early 30s. Her dark hair framed her face neatly, and she wore a simple blue dress that made her look approachable. Yet, there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a sense of purpose that stood out even before she said a word. "Welcome to the show, Karoline," Steve said warmly as she took her seat across from him. "It's great to have you here." "Thank you for having me, Steve," Karoline replied with a polite smile. Her voice was soft but steady, and her eyes met his with a directness that surprised him. "So," Steve began, leaning back slightly in his chair, "you've been making headlines lately for your work in politics and advocacy. Tell us a little bit about what you do." Karoline nodded, taking a deep breath before answering. "Well, I focus on issues that affect everyday people, things like education, healthcare, and most importantly, mental health. I believe we need to create systems that actually support individuals instead of leaving them behind." Steve raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's a pretty big mission. What got you interested in these topics?" Karoline hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak, her tone shifting from professional to personal. "I grew up in a small town in Ohio. It wasn't exactly a place where people talked openly about struggles, especially emotional ones. If you were struggling, you were supposed to tough it out. But I saw firsthand how damaging that mindset can be." She paused, glancing down at her hands before continuing. "My family dealt with its share of challenges. My dad worked long hours at a factory, and my mom stayed home to take care of us kids. Money was tight and stress was high. But no one ever really talked about how hard things were. We just kept going." Steve listened intently, nodding along. He could relate to parts of her story. Growing up, his own family hadn't been wealthy either, and he remembered the weight of unspoken burdens. "That must have been tough," he said gently. "Did things change as you got older?" "They did," Karoline said, her expression softening slightly. "When I went to college, I realized there was another way to live. People weren't afraid to ask for help or admit they were struggling. It opened my eyes to how important it is to have conversations about mental health. not just for individuals, but for communities as a whole. Steve leaned forward, genuinely curious now. That's powerful. So, when did you decide to turn this passion into your career? Karoline smiled faintly. Honestly, it wasn't a decision I made overnight. It happened gradually. After college, I worked in various roles related to policy making, but it wasn't until my brother Daniel came back from Afghanistan that I truly understood why this work mattered so much. At the mention of her brother, Karoline's voice wavered slightly. Steve noticed the change immediately. Daniel served in the military? He asked, his tone softer now. Yes, Karoline replied, her gaze dropping again. He joined right after high school. At first he loved it, the discipline, the camaraderie. But then, things changed. He saw things no one should ever have to see. When he came home, he wasn't the same person anymore. Steve's chest tightened. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it directly from someone who lived it was different. What happened when he returned? He asked carefully. Karoline took a shaky breath. He tried to adjust. He went to counseling, took medication, did everything he was supposed to do, but nothing seemed to work. He felt like no one understood what he was going through, not even me. And then, her voice trailed off, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. Steve reached out instinctively, placing a hand on hers. Take your time, he said quietly. The studio, which had been buzzing with chatter just moments ago, was now completely silent. Even the crew seemed frozen in place, holding their breaths. After a long pause, Karoline continued. One night, Daniel made the choice to end his suffering. We found him the next morning. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to finish. Losing him broke our family in ways I don't think we'll ever fully recover from, but it also gave me clarity. I knew I had to use my voice to fight for others like him, people who feel invisible, forgotten, or abandoned. Steve sat back, momentarily speechless. He had planned for this to be a light-hearted interview, a chance to showcase another rising star. Instead, he found himself staring into the face of grief and resilience. For the first time in a long while, he felt unsure of what to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Karoline, I'm so sorry for your loss. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, she admitted. But losing Daniel taught me something important, that silence kills. If we don't talk about these issues, if we don't push for change, more families will suffer. And I refuse to let that happen. The audience, which had been eerily quiet throughout the exchange, erupted into applause. It wasn't the usual kind of applause that followed a joke or a clever remark. It was deeper, more heartfelt. Steve looked out at the crowd, then back at Karoline, realizing that this conversation had struck a nerve far beyond what he anticipated. Well, he said finally, clearing his throat, you're doing incredible work, Karoline. Truly inspiring. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to dive deeper into how we can all help make a difference. As the cameras cut to commercial, Steve exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He glanced at Karoline, who was wiping away tears with a tissue. Despite the heaviness of the moment, he couldn't help but feel grateful for her courage, for the connection they had formed, and for the opportunity to shine a light on something so important. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the show returned from another commercial break. Steve Harvey adjusted his tie, glancing briefly at Karoline Leavitt before turning back to the camera. His face carried a mixture of determination and vulnerability, emotions that had been stirred up by their earlier conversation. The audience, too, seemed more engaged than usual, their eyes fixed on the stage as if they didn't want to miss a single word. All right, folks, Steve began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. We're back with Karoline Leavitt, and tonight has already been such a powerful journey. But there's still so much more to talk about. Before we continue, I just want to remind everyone watching at home, you don't have to face these struggles alone. There are resources out there, people who care, and communities ready to support you. Karoline nodded in agreement, her expression thoughtful. That's exactly right, Steve. One of the biggest barriers for veterans, and really, anyone dealing with mental health challenges, is feeling like no one understands or cares. Breaking that silence is crucial. Steve leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. You mentioned earlier that you're working on a documentary series about veterans' stories. Can you tell us more about what inspired this project and how it will help? Karoline took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Absolutely. When my brother Daniel passed, I found myself going through his things. In one of his journals, I discovered something that changed everything for me. He had written letters, not just random notes, but heartfelt messages meant for other people. Some were addressed to family members, others to friends, and even some to strangers he imagined might read them someday. She paused, her voice trembling, slightly. One letter stood out. It was written to anyone willing to listen. In it, Daniel talked about his experiences overseas, the pain of coming home, and his plea for society to do better for its heroes. Reading those words broke my heart, but it also gave me hope. It made me realize that Daniel's story could inspire change if I shared it with the world. Steve listened intently, his brow furrowed. So, you decided to turn these letters into a documentary? Yes, Karoline replied, her voice growing stronger. I wanted to honor Daniel's memory by amplifying his message, but I also knew that his story wasn't unique. Thousands of veterans go through similar struggles every day, so I started reaching out to other families, asking if they'd be willing to share their loved ones' stories. To my surprise, many said yes. She explained how the documentary would feature interviews with veterans, family members, and mental health professionals. Each episode would focus on a different theme: PTSD, reintegration into civilian life, the stigma surrounding mental health, and more. Through these stories, viewers would gain insight not only into the challenges faced by veterans, but also into the resilience and strength that define them. That sounds incredible, Steve said, his admiration evident. Do you think sharing these stories will help reduce the stigma around mental health? I believe it can, Karoline answered confidently. When people see real faces and hear real voices, it becomes harder to ignore the issue. These aren't just statistics. They're human beings with dreams, fears, and families who love them. By putting these stories front and center, we can start breaking down the walls of shame and silence. Steve nodded thoughtfully. It's funny. We often think of veterans as superheroes, and in many ways they are. But what your project highlights is that even superheroes need help sometimes. They're human, just like the rest of us. Karoline smiled faintly. Exactly. We tend to put veterans on pedestals, which can actually make it harder for them to ask for help. If we treat them like regular people who've been through extraordinary circumstances, maybe they'll feel less pressure to hide their pain. As the conversation continued, Steve found himself reflecting on his own experiences with Marcus, his cousin. He remembered how Marcus had always tried to appear strong, even when he was clearly struggling. Steve wondered if things might have turned out differently if someone had reached out sooner, if someone had shown him that it was okay to be vulnerable. Karoline, Steve said after a moment, what you're doing reminds me of something my grandmother used to say. She'd always tell me, a burden shared is a burden halved. It's simple advice, but it's true. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, I'm here for you, to make all the difference. Karoline nodded, her eyes glistening. That's beautiful, Steve, and it's so true. Reaching out doesn't have to be complicated. A text, a phone call, even just sitting quietly with someone, it can mean the world to them. The audience murmured in agreement, many nodding along. The connection between Steve and Karoline felt genuine, like two people who had found common ground despite their different backgrounds. For the first time that evening, a sense of hope began to creep into the room. Steve glanced at the clock, realizing they were nearing the end of the segment. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one last question. What's the most important thing you've learned through all of this? If there's one message you could leave with our viewers tonight, what would it be? Karoline hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the audience. Then she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. I've learned that healing isn't linear. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful. But it's possible, and it starts with connection, with reaching out, listening, and showing up for each other. My brother Daniel taught me that love isn't enough unless it's paired with action. So my message to everyone watching is this: don't wait until it's too late. Reach out to the people in your life. Ask how they're doing. Be present. Because those small moments of connection can save lives. The audience erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the studio like waves crashing against a shore. Steve wiped a tear from his eye, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He looked at Karoline, seeing not just a guest but a kindred spirit. A woman determined to turn grief into purpose. Well, Karoline, Steve said finally, his voice thick with emotion. You've given us all so much to think about tonight. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story, and for reminding us of the power of compassion. Thank you, Steve, Karoline replied, her smile soft yet radiant. This conversation means the world to me. As the cameras cut to another commercial break, Steve sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The weight of the evening pressed heavily on him. But it was a good kind of weight, the kind that comes from knowing you've touched hearts and sparked change. He glanced at Karoline, who was wiping away fresh tears, and realized that this night would stay with him forever. Little did either of them know, the impact of their conversation was only beginning. Across living rooms and bedrooms, viewers were tuning in, moved by the raw honesty of the discussion. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions as people shared their own stories and pledged to take action. Lives were being changed. One conversation, one connection, one moment of courage at a time. When the show returned from commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The lighthearted energy that usually filled the room was replaced with something heavier, more profound. Steve Harvey sat across from Karoline Leavitt, his usual playful demeanor toned down. He glanced at her briefly before turning to the camera, his expression thoughtful. "Welcome back, everyone," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We're here with Karoline Leavitt, who has been sharing some incredibly powerful stories about her life and her work. Before the break, we talked about her brother Daniel and the struggles he faced after returning from Afghanistan. It's a story that hits close to home for many families, and it's one we need to keep talking about." Karoline nodded, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. She took a deep breath, composing herself. "Thank you, Steve. I know it's not easy to hear these kinds of stories, but they're important. Too many people are suffering in silence, and if sharing my experience can help even one person feel less alone, then it's worth it." Steve leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "That's exactly why I wanted to bring you on the show tonight. Your story isn't just about loss, it's also about resilience and action. You've turned your pain into purpose. Can you tell us more about how you're working to make a difference?" Karoline hesitated for a moment as if gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. "After Daniel passed, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what I could do to honor his memory. I realized that while I couldn't change what happened to him, I could fight to prevent others from going through the same thing. That's when I decided to focus my efforts on mental health advocacy, especially for veterans." She explained how she started volunteering at local organizations that supported veterans and their families. At first, it was overwhelming. She met men and women who carried invisible wounds, wounds that society often ignored. Many of them struggled with PTSD, depression, or anxiety, yet they felt ashamed to ask for help. Some didn't even know where to begin. "One day," Karoline continued, "I met a veteran named Ryan. He had served in Iraq and came back to find that his marriage was falling apart. His job prospects were slim, and he couldn't shake the nightmares that haunted him every night. But what struck me most about Ryan was his determination to get better. He told me, 'I don't want to be a statistic. I want to live.' Those words stuck with me because they reminded me of Daniel." Steve listened intently, nodding along. "Ryan sounds like an incredible person. Did he inspire any specific changes in your approach?" Yes, actually, Karoline replied. Talking to Ryan made me realize that we need to meet people where they are. Not everyone is ready to walk into a therapist's office or join a support group right away. Sometimes all they need is someone to listen, to really hear them without judgment. So I started organizing community events where veterans could come together, share their stories, and connect with others who understood what they were going through. She described these gatherings as informal and welcoming. There were no strict agendas, just open spaces where people could talk, laugh, cry, or simply sit quietly if that's what they needed. Over time, these events grew, attracting not only veterans, but also their families, friends, and neighbors, and word spread, and soon Karoline found herself leading workshops and speaking at conferences about the importance of creating safe spaces for healing. That must have been quite a journey, Steve said, his tone warm and encouraging. But let me ask you this, what keeps you going? Advocacy work can be exhausting, both emotionally and physically. How do you stay motivated? Karoline smiled softly, her gaze drifting toward the audience. It's not always easy, I'll admit that. There are days when I feel overwhelmed, when the weight of everything feels unbearable. But then I think about Daniel. I remember how much he loved life, how much he cared about helping others. He used to say, Karoline, if you ever see someone drowning, throw them a rope. And that's what I try to do every day. I throw ropes. Her words resonated deeply with Steve, who found himself reflecting on his own life. He thought about his cousin Marcus, who had served in the military and faced similar challenges after coming home. Marcus rarely spoke about his experiences, but Steve knew that beneath his stoic exterior lay a man burdened by memories he couldn't escape. I have to share something personal with you, Steve said suddenly, surprising even himself. My cousin Marcus, he's a veteran too. He served in Desert Storm, and when he came back, things weren't the same. He struggled with anger, insomnia, and guilt. For years, our family didn't know how to help him. We tried everything, therapy, medication, church, but nothing seemed to stick. Karoline looked at him, her expression filled with empathy. That must have been hard for your family. It was, Steve admitted, his voice cracking slightly. And honestly, I don't think we handled it well. We didn't understand what he was going through, and instead of reaching out, we pulled away. It wasn't until recently that I realized how much we failed him. Hearing your story tonight, it makes me wish we had done more. The sincerity in Steve's voice touched Karoline. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. You're doing something now, Steve. By having this conversation, by shining a light on these issues, you're helping others avoid the same mistakes. That matters. Steve nodded, blinking back tears. He hadn't planned to open up like this, but there was something about Karoline's honesty that made him want to be vulnerable too. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, their shared grief bridging the gap between stranger and friend. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained completely still. Even the crew behind the scenes seemed affected, their usual chatter replaced by quiet reverence. It was rare to witness such raw emotion on live television, and everyone present knew they were part of something special. Finally, Steve cleared his throat and turned back to Karoline. You mentioned earlier that you organize events for veterans and their families. What's next for you? Where do you see this work taking you? Karoline thought for a moment before answering. Right now, I'm focused on expanding the reach of these events. I want to take them nationwide, maybe even global someday. But beyond that, I'm working on a project that I hope will make a real impact. A documentary series that tells the stories of veterans and their journeys toward healing. A documentary? Steve asked, his interest piqued. That sounds amazing. What inspired you to go in that direction? Well, Karoline explained, I believe stories have power. They can educate, inspire, and create empathy. If we can show people what veterans go through, not just the struggles, but also the triumphs, we can start breaking down the stigma surrounding mental health. Plus, it gives veterans a platform to speak for themselves, which is something they don't always get. Steve nodded approvingly. That's a fantastic idea. I'd love to hear more about it as it develops. Maybe we can even collaborate somehow. I'd like that, Karoline said with a smile. Collaboration is key. No one person can solve these problems alone. It takes all of us working together. As the segment neared its end, Steve took a moment to address the audience directly. Folks, what we've heard tonight is just the beginning. Karoline's work is a reminder that we all have a role to play in supporting those around us. Whether it's checking in on a neighbor, volunteering at a local organization, or simply listening when someone needs to talk, every action counts. He turned back to Karoline, his expression softening. Thank you for being here tonight, Karoline. Thank you for sharing your story and for reminding us of the importance of compassion and connection. Karoline smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Steve. This means so much to me. The audience erupted into applause once again, this time louder and more heartfelt than before. As the cameras cut to another commercial break, Steve exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. He glanced at Karoline, who was wiping away fresh tears, and realized that this conversation had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. Little did he know, the ripple effects of this night would extend far beyond the confines of the studio. Lives were about to be touched, perspectives shifted, and hearts opened, all because two people chose to speak their truths. The final segment of the show was approaching, and the energy in the studio had shifted once again. It wasn't just the weight of the conversation that lingered in the air. It was the sense of possibility, the feeling that something meaningful had been set into motion. Steve Harvey sat across from Karoline Leavitt, his usual charm tempered by a newfound seriousness. He glanced at her briefly, then turned to the audience with a determined look on his face. All right, folks, he began, his voice steady but heartfelt. We've talked about a lot tonight, about loss, resilience, and the importance of connection. But now I want to focus on what we can do moving forward. Because awareness is important, but action is where real change happens. Karoline nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's exactly right, Steve. Talking about these issues is just the first step. The next step is doing something about them. Steve leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. Let's start with resources. For anyone watching at home who might be struggling, or knows someone who is, what should they do? Where can they turn for help? Karoline took a moment to gather her thoughts before answering. There are so many organizations out there, dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. Groups like Veterans Affairs, Wounded Warrior Project, and Give an Hour offer counseling, job training, and other services. There are also hotlines available 24/7 for anyone in crisis. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is one, and there's also a specific Veterans Crisis Line that provides support tailored to military personnel and their loved ones. She paused, glancing down at her hands. But beyond these formal resources, I encourage people to lean on their communities. If you know someone who's struggling, don't wait for them to reach out. Check in on them. Invite them over for coffee, send them a text, or just sit with them if they need company. Sometimes the simplest gestures can make the biggest difference. Steve nodded, his eyes softening. That's such good advice. And it's not just about veterans either. These principles apply to everyone. Whether it's a friend going through a tough time, a coworker dealing with stress, or even yourself, reaching out is key. He turned to the camera, addressing the viewers directly. If you're watching right now and you're feeling overwhelmed, please know that you're not alone. There are people who care about you and want to help. Don't be afraid to ask for support. You deserve it. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. Karoline smiled faintly, touched by the warmth of the response. She knew that while words were powerful, they needed to be backed by action. That's why she had come prepared with more than just stories. She had a plan. Steve, she said, her tone shifting to something firmer and more purposeful. I'd like to share something else with you and the audience tonight. Before coming here, I reached out to several veteran-focused organizations and mental health advocates. Together, we've been working on a campaign called Voices of Valor. Its goal is to amplify the stories of veterans and spark conversations about mental health across the country. Steve's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Wow, that sounds incredible. Tell us more about it. Karoline explained that Voices of Valor would involve a series of events, workshops, and online initiatives designed to educate the public and provide support to those in need. Local chapters would host storytelling sessions where veterans could share their experiences in safe, welcoming environments. Schools and community centers would host panels featuring mental health experts and advocates. Social media campaigns would encourage people to share messages of gratitude and solidarity with veterans using the hashtag #ListenToOurHeroes. We're also partnering with businesses and nonprofits to raise funds for mental health programs, Karoline added. Every dollar raised will go toward expanding access to therapy, hiring more counselors trained in trauma-informed care, and creating peer support networks for veterans and their families. Steve listened intently, his admiration growing with each detail. This is amazing, Karoline. It's clear you've put so much thought and effort into this. How can our viewers get involved? Well, Karoline replied, her smile widening, there are plenty of ways to contribute. People can donate to the campaign, volunteer at local events, or simply spread the word. Even sharing a post on social media can help raise awareness. Every little bit counts. Steve nodded enthusiastically. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to do my part too. Starting tonight, I'm pledging to use my platform to keep this conversation going. I'll be hosting follow-up segments on future shows, featuring guests who are making a difference in this space. We'll also highlight resources and success stories to inspire others to take action. The audience cheered loudly, clearly moved by Steve's commitment. Karoline looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Steve. Your support means so much. Together we can create real change. Steve smiled warmly. It's the least I can do. After everything you've shared tonight, I feel inspired to do more. This isn't just your fight. It's all of ours. The segment drew to a close. Steve turned back to the camera, his voice filled with conviction. Folks, let's remember this moment. Let's remember the courage it takes to speak up, to ask for help, and to stand by one another. Tonight, Karoline has shown us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there is hope. There is always hope. He gestured toward Karoline, who stood up to join him at the front of the stage. Please give another round of applause for Karoline Leavitt, a true advocate for change and a beacon of strength. The audience erupted into thunderous applause, standing to their feet as Karoline waved humbly. For a moment, the heaviness of the evening gave way to a sense of unity and purpose. Strangers exchanged smiles, nodding in agreement as they absorbed the message of the night. When the cameras finally cut to commercial, Steve exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He glanced at Karoline, who was wiping away tears, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. You did amazing tonight, he said softly. I mean it. You've touched so many lives, including mine. Karoline smiled through her tears. Thank you, Steve. This wouldn't have been possible without you. Thank you for giving me this platform. Steve shook his head. No, thank you. You reminded me why I do what I do, to connect with people, to make a difference. Tonight, you've done both. Backstage, the crew buzzed with excitement, discussing how powerful the episode had been. Some wiped away tears while others hugged one another, moved by the raw emotion of the night. It was rare for a talk show to leave such a lasting impression, but this one had done just that. As the credits rolled and the audience began to file out of the studio, Steve and Karoline stood together, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words of gratitude. They knew that the work didn't end here, that the real challenge lay in keeping the momentum going. But for now they allowed themselves a moment of peace, knowing they had planted seeds of hope that would grow far beyond the confines of the studio. Little did they realize the impact of their conversation was already spreading. Across the country, viewers tuned in, their hearts stirred by the stories of resilience and compassion. Messages poured in on social media as people pledged to check in on loved ones, volunteer their time, and support causes close to their hearts. Lives were being changed. One story, one connection, one act of kindness at a time. And in that moment, amidst the applause and the tears, Steve and Karoline shared a silent understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can lead to the greatest transformations. Weeks had passed since the unforgettable episode of Steve Harvey's talk show, but its impact lingered like a ripple spreading across calm water. Viewers who had tuned in that night found themselves unable to shake the emotions stirred by Karoline Leavitt's story and Steve's heartfelt response. Social media platforms buzzed with posts from people sharing their own struggles, paying tribute to loved ones they had lost, or pledging to take action in support of mental health awareness. The hashtag #ListenToOurHeroes trended for days, sparking conversations far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Karoline returned home to Ohio after her appearance on the show. Exhausted, but hopeful. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers thanking her for speaking out. Some shared stories of veterans and their families who were still fighting battles no one could see. Others expressed gratitude for the resources she had mentioned during the interview, saying they planned to reach out for help, something they had been too afraid to do before. Each message reminded Karoline why she had chosen this path, even when it felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, Steve Harvey couldn't stop thinking about the night either. For years, he had used humor to connect with his audience, bringing laughter and joy into millions of homes. But now, he realized there was another kind of connection, one rooted in vulnerability and empathy that could leave an equally lasting impression. He started incorporating more segments about mental health and advocacy into his show, inviting guests who worked tirelessly to make a difference. Every time someone thanked him for shining a light on these issues, he thought back to Karoline and her quiet courage. One crisp autumn afternoon, Steve decided to check in with Karoline. He called her up, his voice warm and friendly. "Hey, Karoline, it's Steve. How are you holding up?" Karoline chuckled softly. "I'm doing okay, all things considered. It's been a whirlwind, but I'm grateful for everything that's come out of it." "I can imagine," Steve replied. "The response has been incredible. People are really stepping up. I've gotten so many emails and letters from viewers who said your story inspired them to act." "That's amazing to hear," Karoline said, her tone brightening. "It's exactly what we hoped for. Have you heard anything specific that stood out?" Steve leaned back in his chair, smiling as he recalled one particular letter. There was this guy named Paul. He's a veteran who watched the show with his wife. He said he'd been bottling up his feelings for years, too scared to talk about them. But after hearing you and me discuss how important it is to ask for help, he finally opened up to his family. Now they're working together to get him the support he needs. Karoline's eyes welled up, even though Steve couldn't see her through the phone. "That's beautiful, Steve. That's exactly why I do this work. Hearing stories like Paul's makes it all worth it." They talked for a while longer, exchanging updates on their respective projects. Karoline mentioned that the Voices of Valor campaign had gained significant traction, with donations pouring in and volunteers signing up across the country. Local chapters were hosting storytelling events, where veterans gathered to share their experiences in safe, supportive spaces. The documentary series she had dreamed of was also moving forward, thanks to partnerships with filmmakers eager to amplify these voices. Steve listened intently, feeling a swell of pride. "You've done so much already, Karoline. I'm honestly in awe of you." "Well, I couldn't have done any of it without you," Karoline replied sincerely. "Your platform gave me the chance to reach people I never would have otherwise." "Thank you for that," Steve chuckled modestly. "Don't thank me yet. I've got something else I want to do. Remember how I told you I wanted to keep the conversation going? Well, Veterans Day is coming up, and I think it's the perfect opportunity to dedicate an entire episode to honoring veterans and raising awareness about mental health. What do you say? You want to co-host it with me?" Karoline gasped, caught off guard by the offer. "Are you serious? That would be incredible." Of course I'm serious," Steve said warmly. "You're the heart behind this movement. Having you there will mean so much, not just to me, but to everyone watching." A few weeks later, the Veterans Day special aired live from New York City. The studio was decorated with flags and banners, creating a patriotic yet intimate atmosphere. Steve welcomed Karoline onto the stage once again, this time not as a guest but as a partner in the evening's mission. Together, they introduced the audience to a lineup of inspiring individuals, veterans, advocates, and mental health professionals, all united by a common goal: to break the stigma surrounding mental health and honor those who served. Throughout the show, personal stories took center stage. A retired Marine named Jacob spoke about overcoming addiction and finding purpose through peer support groups. A young widow named Lisa shared how losing her husband to suicide had motivated her to become a counselor, specializing in trauma care. Even Steve joined in, recounting moments from his childhood spent admiring his cousin Marcus and vowing to keep advocating for veterans' rights. As the final segment approached, Steve turned to Karoline, his voice filled with emotion. "This has been such an incredible night, hasn't it? So many brave people sharing their truths, reminding us of the power of connection." Karoline nodded, her eyes glistening. "It really has. And it's proof that when we come together, as families, communities, and a nation, we can create change. None of this would have been possible without everyone who stepped up to listen, learn, and act." Steve smiled, placing a hand on hers. "You know, Karoline, sometimes I think we underestimate the strength it takes to be vulnerable. Tonight we've seen that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. It's what brings us closer, heals wounds, and builds bridges." The audience erupted into applause, standing to their feet in a standing ovation. For a moment, the weight of the evening, the pain, the hope, the resilience, hung in the air, connecting everyone present. Strangers exchanged smiles, nodding in agreement as they absorbed the message of the night. When the cameras finally cut to commercial, Steve exhaled deeply, turning to Karoline with a grin. "Well, we did it. We made a difference tonight." "You did it, Steve," Karoline corrected gently. "You gave these stories a platform, and you reminded people that they're not alone." Steve shook his head, his expression soft. "No, we did it. None of this happens without you." Backstage, the crew gathered around, congratulating each other on pulling off such a powerful episode. Some hugged, others wiped away tears, and a few snapped photos to remember the moment. It wasn't every day they got to witness something so impactful, a reminder of why they chose careers in storytelling. In the weeks that followed, the effects of the Veterans Day special continued to reverberate. Schools incorporated clips from the show into their lesson plans, teaching students about empathy and civic responsibility. Churches and community centers organized fundraisers to support local veteran organizations. Even policymakers cited the program during debates, urging for increased funding for mental health services. For Steve, the experience marked a turning point. While he would always cherish making people laugh, he discovered a new sense of fulfillment in using his platform to spark meaningful conversations. His friendship with Karoline grew stronger, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They stayed in touch regularly, brainstorming ways to expand their advocacy efforts. As for Karoline, she carried Daniel's memory with her wherever she went, knowing his voice had reached farther than she ever imagined. She received letters from veterans and families expressing how his story gave them hope and courage to seek help. Through her work, she ensured that Daniel's legacy lived on, not as a symbol of loss, but as a beacon of resilience and change. One chilly December evening, as snow began to fall over New York City, Steve sat in his dressing room reflecting on the journey. He thought about Karoline, about Daniel, and about all the lives touched by their collective efforts. Though tears had been shed along the way, he realized they weren't signs of weakness. They were testaments to the strength found in connection, compassion, and shared humanity. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city outside, Steve knew one thing for certain. The world was better because two people had dared to speak their truths.